just a scientist, former teacher, and psychology grad student here to break down brain behavior and everything in between.
And I'm Tristan, a French entrepreneur with a background in business and a growing passion for mental health in the workplace.
You're listening to Office Hours with Tristan Vivier and Courtney Faco. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Office Hours. So I don't have a video or a TikTok coming at you this week. Unfortunately, my For You page just wasn't dialed in on the business end. It was more on like stacking challenges and crumble cookie reviews. That was literally all that was flooding my For You page. But I was driving the other day and I was just like pondering our last two podcasts. And I got thinking about like what drives all of this. Yeah, it might be toxic leadership. Yes, it might be the burnout. But at the end of the day, like, why are we seeing such a rise in all of this? And I really thought about the idea of loyalty. Loyalty to your employer, loyalty to your workplace. And I started to do some research around that. I'm like, maybe it is. Maybe we've had a change in our beliefs and values surrounding loyalty.
Yeah. No, absolutely, cool. And I think that's such an interesting topic, and I'm really excited to talk about it today because, yeah, I think there's been a change. I've seen it myself just talking to parents, older siblings, etc., family members. And yeah, I think there's been a huge shift. So yeah, excited to talk about it.
I agree. And at first I was like, well, has there really been? Or like, are we just as loyal as we were in the past? Are we just being babies about it? It was my first kind of thought.
Yeah.
And as I researched, I found that as of 2004, the average person only stays at a job for about 3.9 years. And that's the lowest it's been since 2002, which I thought was kind of crazy. Like a piece of me was like 3.9 years. Okay, that's pretty high. Like that's a long time. That's almost 4 years to stay, like better than me. At the same time, I'm like, that does also seem low, like in the scope of life, in the scope of your work life. That's not a long time to be staying at a job. And something that my research kind of took me down was this idea that the ideal career path in the past was to land a secure job that was full-time and stay there for decades or be this like lifer, right? You probably heard the term. We probably all heard the term like, oh, they're a lifer. They're going to be here forever. They're a lifer. And I thought to myself, like, why? Why the shift? And I had a couple of thoughts on like the psychology end, but also just on what I've seen in the school system as well. When our grandparents would have been working and being lifers, they probably had the goal of a nuclear family. They probably had some unfortunate gender roles where the man would have probably went to work full time. It was your job to stay. It was your job to provide. And you kind of just did it because your role in life was maybe not to be happy, but to support your family because you're supposed to get married, have kids, and die. Ultimately, like, right? Like, really, but that's what we saw. So it's kind of like made me think, like, why? Is it because our values have shifted and that's no longer the goal in life anymore? I don't know. But anyway, the idea of this lifer culture is by definition where you work at one company for most of your working life, if not your whole working life or your whole career. So I don't know about you, Tris, but I don't think I'm going to be a lifer anywhere. I like job hopping a little bit too much, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if I find a good culture, if I find an organization that values has the same values as myself, then yeah.
Straight up, I'm a little too squirrely. Like I get a little too bored too quick. And if like we talked about, if you're not challenging your employees in a positive way, you're getting bored. And then they're probably going to job hop, which might lead to the 3.9 years at a job. you're getting bored, there's stagnation. But you've probably experienced a lifer, whether it's your grandparent, parent, whomever. But typically, like when I think of a lifer, I think of them saying things like, back in my day, we stayed at the same job until our hair turned gray and we liked it. And I'm like, did you really like it, Grandpa? Did you really enjoy being at that job for 10, 20, 30 years? I don't know. But there is some data to kind of back up this lifer statement. So in the 80s, men in their late 50s and early 50s were averaging over 10 years with the same employer. And even as recently as the early 20s, more than half of workers aged 60 to 64 had been with their current job for over a decade. So I like this statistic because it said people between the ages of 60 and 64, which would be that generation whom were encouraged to be lifers, who felt the need to be lifers. So it didn't super surprise me, but I am intrigued to look at that lifer rate for like our generations. I'm
Yeah.
excited to kind of talk about that. So why do you think they stayed there, Tris? Like that was my thought, was like, was it the family dynamic? Like what encouraged Grandpa Joe to stay for his whole working career at the same mundane job, like doing the same thing day in, day out? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I think you nailed it, and it's true. Actually, I didn't even think about it before you mentioned it, but definitely, I think the gender roles at that time and the standard family life of the man going to work and having to provide for the family, and so I think with that came pressure of, what if I lose my job? What if I don't find a job, right?
Mhm,
Don't find another good job. I think another one is I think loyalty was really valued at that time.
mhm,
I think there was a big emphasis on staying with that company, showed who you are as a person and, how loyal you are and maybe some honor to that, right? Which I think, not saying that people nowadays don't have honor or don't have loyalty. I think it's just maybe shifted the mindset of like, I don't really care that much about what others think about me. Maybe I just care more about what
mhm.
it's for me. I don't know. That might be it, might be not be it. That's just the kind of thought that came into my mind of, I think there's been a shift in values, right? And I think it's not loyalty's gone. I think it's just loyalty's been reshaped. And what does loyalty mean? I think nowadays is different than what it meant for them. And I think for them, it was like, yeah, I'm just going to stay at my job, make some money, and I'm going to provide for my family. And I'm going to be seen as that loyal person that can be there through thick and thin. And that's what is important to me. And I don't think that that's the same values as people have nowadays, which is fair.
I love what you said about like loyalty being reshaped. And I feel like we're going to touch on that here a little bit later, which I'm excited for our listeners to hear about. But in my research on all of this, we came up with kind of the big four, and you touched on the fourth one, which is
Yeah.
loyalty in general, but like that old school loyalty. So what I found was one of the biggest driving forces behind being a lifer was the dream of this pension, or the
Oh,
promise of this pension, which they've termed these golden handcuffs, which kind of kept you handcuffed to your job with this little like dangling carrot of like, if you stay here, you'll be able to retire. And Grandpa Joe's like, yes, absolutely. And just kept following the carrot. So when we're talking about the pension, we're talking about ultimately the promise of this guaranteed income for retirement. And if we go way, way back to like pre-World War II, post-World War II, in and around that era, we're kind of talking about a significant amount of money being put into pension. And we didn't have as much inflation as we do today. So the money you're putting into your pension and the money you were receiving when you retired was quite significant. The ability for you to actually live off of your pension, for it to be a livable wage in retirement, which I feel like, honestly, if someone had told me today and was like, here's the dangling carrot, we're going to work with inflation and give you a pension that 30, 40 years from now, you're going to live comfortably off of, I'd be like, where's my pen? Like, sign me up. I'll stay there as long as possible. So I definitely see how those older generations were definitely kind of handcuffed to their job by that
Yeah.
promise. The second thing was climbing the ladder. So, like, literally working your way up through promotion. So when you had a promotion, you probably didn't get it back in the day because of your skill. Unfortunately, there's been research surrounding promotions when Grandpa Joe was working was probably because of like who you knew or who was your friend in the company, which you kind of talked about where if you stuck around, you were maybe viewed differently. It was maybe a bit more prestigious if you could work your way up in the company. I feel like thinking back to even how my grandparents talked, it was like kind of brag-worthy to be like, I stayed there for 25 years. And by the end, I was VP, right? Like there was this bragging elite component to it where I feel like nowadays, if you hear someone say, oh, I've been working at this company for 25 years, I go, oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? Do you not respect yourself? Like what's happening? So such a shift,
Yeah.
right? Such a shift. The third thing was just fewer doors to walk through. So the reality was we weren't connected through social media. We didn't see what other jobs look like necessarily. We didn't have someone on TikTok telling us the way your boss is treating you is super toxic and probably get out of there. We didn't have podcasts to talk about this stuff. You knew what you knew, and that was pretty much it. So they didn't have this wide scope kind of sense that we have now of the world. And then the
Yeah.
fourth, the final reason that I found in my studies was just what you talked about, loyalty. There was a huge emphasis on loyalty, not just between you to your company, but also your company to you. So it was kind of like a two-way street at some point. A 1972 study actually showed 79% of employees respected management authority, and over 60% believed obedience was more important than innovation. So that stat kind of scared me a little. I'm like, I don't know how I'd feel if I walked in to my first day of a job and my boss sat down and said, you're going to be obedient and you're going to do what I say and you're going to like it and you're not going to challenge me. I'd be like, ooh, no, ma'am. And I would probably walk out the door and be like, this place just isn't
Yeah.
for me. So, according to managers, loyalty wasn't necessarily earned. I feel like a lot of times now they feel like you're going to be loyal if they give you a pizza party or
Yeah.
like a feedback session. And like I can kind of talk to that. I feel like even nowadays, like some companies are like, you should be loyal to us. We gave you a staff barbecue on Friday. And you're like, wow, thanks for the free smoky. Like, yes, I will absolutely give up my work-life balance and my family time because you know I love a good cheddar smoky, Karen. Like, absolutely not. Right? So between all of that, golden handcuffs, loyalty, fewer doors to walk through, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think it's talking to like I said, talking to different generations and seeing what you're speaking about. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I see why people stay that long. Would it work for me? No, but that's the what we're talking about, right? It's the change in generations and how we view loyalty. But I can definitely see at that time, especially look at post World War II. After that happened, obviously it was a lot of uncertainty in that time, a lot of issues economically for a lot of different countries post World War II, but also followed with a boom. And I think a lot of people were very just happy to have their life, have their pension, and that's super fair and understandable. I think it's super interesting, to be honest, to see the shift that's happened. And when we're going to talk about Generation Z and their approach to loyalty and what they value right nowadays in work and what kind of gets their loyalty is really different from that. And I think they don't care as much about, about necessarily about the golden handcuffs. Maybe they care about more about values and things that they didn't care. Obedience definitely would not be one that today would work. But yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think there's a lot to unpack now to understand kind of what is going on and the evolution of loyalty, which is interesting.
Yeah. No, and I can totally speak to even like the pension piece. I don't know, Tris, if you have worked a job in the past where you were contributing to a pension. One of the biggest things I had when I left teaching was the amount of people who are like, "But you're giving up your pension." And I'm like, "Sis, it wouldn't be enough to retire anyway." I was like, "I'd be better off pulling my pension and investing it." You know what I'm saying? And I feel like a lot of our generation is now seeing that our contribution to the pension plan is not it's not enough. It's not gonna be enough to retire. And so that's not so much of a dangling carrot anymore. It's kinda like, "Oh, cool. So
Needs it needs to be more, right? And I think that's where the evolutions come is newer generations want more. And I think that's what's really changed. There's a lot more that they want in a workplace to be loyal. And I think that's been a big change in
yes,
general.
I'm so intrigued for you to tell me a little bit more about how loyalty has evolved.
Okay, so yeah, we spoke about lifers, we spoke about how loyalty used to be. Now let's talk a bit about its evolution. So it's actually quite interesting, like you said, post World War II, it was basically very much the lifer mentality, looking at pensions, even the social norm of staying at your job for a long time. That changed a bit, especially during 2000s, right? Starting in 2000, there was a big tech boom, there was globalization, and just jobs basically became there was more jobs available, and so people started job hopping, especially amongst younger and college educated workers. That became more of a thing after the 2010 with the Great Recession. The actual job tenure decreased a bit. Older workers delayed retirement. There was few job opportunities. People didn't really want to move around, and so yeah, just stayed for a bit longer. Now 2020 is that's been a big shift. I think there's been Gen Z that really came into work life and actually started changing a bit things because they had a different view as to what job tenure should be like and job loyalty should be like. And we'll go into what they're really looking for. But a big one, just to kind of give a bit of some data behind that big change, is around the pensions when you were talking about it. Post World War II era, in the US, around 40% of US firms in the private sector workers were covered by defined benefits pension plans. In 2022, that's dropped to 13%. So clearly that there's been a shift from the employer's perspective, first not giving pensions, but also that may be due to Gen Z not caring that much about it either, right? But so there's kind of been that big shift around working for a pension versus not working for a pension. Now, it can be argued if that's the chicken and egg problem. Was it done by the employers who didn't want to give pensions, and so people started becoming less loyal, or is it just that employees didn't care that much about pensions, and so that wasn't a real priority? Don't know. But if we go into Gen Z and kind of like now the evolution of what the modern workforce is looking for. So first of all, when I mentioned Gen Z, I mentioned it like just to kind of give our listeners a bit of an idea for those, because personally, I didn't actually even know that I was part of Gen Z, is those born primarily between 1997 and 2012. So obviously those are people who are really coming into the workforce in 2025. And to give you a bit of idea of job tenure, when we said it's changed a lot, their average job tenure for Gen Z is between 1.8 years to 2.3 years, which is really low, right? Like
Mhm.
that's not, that's kind of, yeah, for me, that was kind
Yeah,
of,
that's low.
that's very, very low, right? It's like when you look at I know it's later in life, they've probably established their careers a bit more, but even 45 to 50-year-olds you were mentioning was even around 7.5
Mhm.
nowadays. It's still, it's a big gap between those two, right? That's some of them is less than 2 years, right? Any thoughts on that?
A couple of things, like, a couple of things as you were talking, I was like, interesting." It'd be so cool to, like I'm sure people have done studies and there's data surrounding it, and maybe
Mm,
it's a little spinoff for another podcast, I don't know, but when you were talking about that shift in the 20s, like, just personally, I feel like people were allowed a whole different view of the workplace. Like, a lot of people shifted to work from home. And I really don't feel like the mass majority had experienced that. And so it was the status quo. It was what grandpa and grandma and mom and dad had experienced. And that was all you'd seen and heard. And then I think the pandemic kicked up and people went, wow, I don't have to exist for 8 to 12 hours in a cubicle without the ability to have movement breaks or be in my own space or work at my own pace. And I just, from a personal standpoint, I feel like it just really kicked up this like, I don't want to go back to that. Like, there's more to life than that. And I just wonder how many other people kind of felt that way. I don't
Yeah.
know. On the pension side, like for me, just again from personal experiences, the reality is that how much I would gain in a pension over my working career, I could not retire off of my pension.
Yeah.
And so it holds little to no value to
Yeah.
me. So when workplaces advertise a pension, I go, cool, but you better have something else because that's definitely not the buy in, I don't think anymore, especially for like millennials, Gen Z. I think the reality is like we've accepted the reality that a pension's cool and it might help us retire to an extent, but it's not our retirement.
No, no. And I think that's what's interesting. Like, I haven't found a study, looking at if it's more on the employer side that pensions have gone down
Mhm,
so much, or if it's on the basically, is it demand or is it supply, right? Is it like
mhm,
just the demand has decreased so much, so employers haven't really looked at it, or if it's vice versa, just the supply of employers thinking that it's not really valuable and so have just decreased it. I don't know. I find it
mhm.
really interesting that topic.
Yeah,
Might be worth looking into it more in the future. But yeah,
yeah.
um, but to kind of mention on that point, and you were saying with Gen Z and the changes in 2020. Again, I think data's not there yet because it's just been 5 years now, right?
Mhm,
Not long enough to actually look back properly on it and be able to gather some accurate data. But in 2024, only 35 of employees expect to stay with their employees long term, which is kind of
cool.
cool. And 55% of Gen Z workers plan to leave their jobs within 2 years compared to 41% of millennials. So again, that's kind of a big gap even between millennials and Gen Z. That's nearly 15% difference between those that want to stay for 2 years and those that don't. But yeah, there's been a big shift in that mentality of I'm not gonna care that much about what the older generation was looking at in terms of job tenure. If this doesn't work for me, then I'm not gonna stay. And I think it's really important to talk about why, right? Why is that? Why has that changed? And so if we look into Gen Z and what they're looking for and the reasons for the short tenure, a big reason is exploration and growth. I think this generation is very much, seeking diverse experiences, career explorations, just wanting to rapidly develop their skills. And they see that job hopping might be the solution for that. And there was kind of a statistics to back that up, which was like 83% said they will leave their job if they feel stagnant or unchallenged, right? So it's not just you might, progress, but if it's not challenging, then they'll leave and they'll want something else. The second reason, and I think that one is definitely the most important, and we'll go into a company that has done that extremely well, is purpose and value. And I think that's the main differentiator with what previous generation looked at. I think they didn't care that much, at least the data doesn't show that they cared that much about purpose and values. As long as they had a strong pension, they had job security, they were happy, and that's fair enough. But I think that has changed. And I think a big thing around that is our generation needs to feel like their work has a social impact, that their work really, their company values are the same as theirs. And if they're not satisfied with that, they'll move. And again, there's some data around that. 89% say a sense of purpose is critical to their job satisfaction, which is crazy. That's, 9 in 10 people think that. 3% they will leave their jobs if their values clash with their employee culture.
Mm.
Again, big, reason for people leaving, which is kind of crazy. Do you have any thoughts on that one particularly?
I don't know. I think it's kind of cool because we're right on the cusp. Like I'm a millennial, you're a Gen Z, so we kind of get that split perspective. And like I don't know, like personally for myself, I go, I think I would care more. I'd probably fall into that 89% of purpose
Hmm.
being critical. I don't think I would care as much if, like, my values clash with the employer's culture. I feel like that's something, like, you could work through. You could be like, "That's just my workplace." Like, I think it would eventually cause job jumping for sure. But if I had to pick between the two, from my perspective, is I would want to know that I had a purpose in the workplace. So I wasn't going in and just being like, why am I here? Why does this matter? Like, yeah.
No, I agree. I think I'm kind of similar to you. I think for me the sense of purpose is something that's super important, and I've discovered that over time that it's very important to why I want to do work.
Mhm.
Another one, obviously, and you touched upon that, is in 2020, I think really came to light for a lot of people is flexible work and well-being. And again, statistics around that: 77% prioritize work-life balance over long tenure. 72% would leave their job if it lacked flexibility work arrangements, and that can be around, even mental health or workplace culture is basically more important than salary. Essentially, is what they're saying, which again is super interesting. And you see that those two, that's where I think it really comes into shines into light, where the old, I think, generations were more based on salary or benefits, compensation, whereas I think this generation is a lot more around purpose, values, a lot less about salary, flexibility, work-life balance,
Yeah.
etc.
And as you're saying that, I had this thought and I go, do we as millennials and Gen Z, do we appreciate that flexible work and the well-being a bit more? Because our work, as best as we try to set boundaries, our work doesn't leave us. Like,
Mm-mm.
it's on our computers, it's on our devices, it's on our tablets, it's on our phone. We hear the email ping if we forget to set out of office hours. Where back when grandpa was working, when you left the office, you left the office. Like, if they want to get a hold of you, they'd have to really go to their way and call you. And I feel like even then that was very unusual. I
Mhm.
feel like it'd be very unusual. I think another thing we like about the flexible work is we're always on. Like, we have FaceTimes, Zooms, emails coming in. Like, we're podcasting right now, and the cognitive load that subconsciously, I think, presents that we're not even aware of takes a toll. So I think being able to have that flexible workspace and being like, okay, I need to get up for 5 minutes and walk around, or I'm gonna let my dog out, is a perk we for sure have. But I think we have additional challenges that the other generations maybe haven't experienced.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. I think that's a superb point. And it's true, I didn't actually really think about it either, but that makes a lot of sense as to why that has become more important for people nowadays. Is because I think it's otherwise, exactly, if we were in the same standards as before, then we would be working 24 hours a day, right? Because, I mean,
Mhm,
especially if you work for an international company, you have colleagues abroad, you have colleagues, and before it would be very complicated to get in touch with them or take a long time. Right
mhm.
now, in 2 seconds, you're on your phone through WhatsApp, through Zoom, through whatever, right? And so, yeah, no, I think that's super, super interesting, like you mentioned, and I think it's definitely contributes to that change. Another one, obviously, is the eroded trust, and I think a big thing when we spoke about in 2010. When the recession happened, there was less jobs available. I think that was definitely that people stayed because they were scared of moving jobs because there wasn't as many available to them. But I think in 2020 there was definitely a job crisis. There were definitely some issues, a lot of layoffs. That's led to, I think, an even more erosion, because I was only 10 years between the two, a bit more, 2008 to 12 years. I think there was two crises that we've seen where we've seen massive layoffs, and I think that's eroded trust for our generation now coming into the workplace, seeing what has happened now. And I think there's kind of that lack of trust with employees, thinking, am I going to get fired in like 2 years? Am I going to get fired soon? Is there going to be something happening? And I think that's something that's maybe our generation has taken more of an individualistic approach of like, what is good for me instead of necessarily what is good for the company and for the company in general, because they've seen that time where maybe their parents or, themselves in 2020 got fired. And then that kind of eroded that trust. And I think there's kind of a big statistics that I found around this about Generation Z and the lack of trust. Only 36% of Gen Z employees report trusting their immediate supervisors in 2025. Isn't that crazy? Again, 36% that absolutely do not trust their immediate. So this is not talking about like, the director of directors of directors, the CEO. No, it's talking about like your direct manager, right? The supervisor or whoever's directly above you, working with you pretty much on a daily basis, and you do not trust them in any way. That's a lot. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I keep going more on like a psychological rabbit
Mhm.
hole where once again the data is probably just not there. It's only been 5 years, but I know for myself is during the pandemic time I just got really used to having to do everything by myself. Like there wasn't an outlet to turn to. It was very much like I'm alone. I need to figure it out. I need to do. And I could definitely say that could erode some trust once you were back in the workplace, being like, well, is that like really? Like, how do I ask for help? Is the help genuine? I feel like there's a piece of just being forced kind of to be alone where you almost become so hyper independent that trust is hard.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, no, like, yeah, I've been part of companies that have unfortunately had to do some layoffs, and it's such a scary time that I think it definitely erodes trust after a while where you're like, because, and it's not necessarily the manager's fault because I think those decisions happen way above those,
Mhm.
but they have to, you know, pretend like everything's fine, pretend like nothing happened, pretend like, to keep the business going. Could it be dealt with in better ways? There's probably a lot better ways to do it. But I think it is super difficult to go through it as a manager. But I think it definitely can erode trust. If you're an employee, you got your colleagues fired, all of a sudden you're thinking about is, am I going to be next, right? And I think even if it's not necessarily that manager's fault, because it wasn't their choice, I think it makes it difficult, right? And I think, yeah, that's something I've experienced and definitely can result into some lack of trust for organizations. Finally, just one thing when we're talking about values versus salary, 70% of people see values and development as more important than salary for accepting or leading a
Yeah.
group. Crazy, right? Big change. So we spoke about why people are leaving now. Like, let's look at what they're looking for and how can organizations kind of look at this and be like, okay, what do we need to do, right?
Mhm.
So trust, empathy, employee loyalty, those are all linked, right? And I think empathy is a big one. 92% of employees believe an empathetic employee increases their likelihood to stay with the company. So over half, 52%, would even take a pay cut to work in an empathetic culture. So again, shows that empathy, and that comes through trust, that comes through all of that, but just showing, okay, we talk about work-life balance, talking about the ability to, yeah, go understand that you might not be able to work, 12-hour days, and you might, it's maybe not the healthiest thing for your work, for your work-life balance, for your life at home. And an employee that shows that, understands that, and has an empathetic culture of, you have a life outside of work. I want you to be okay as a human first, and then as an employee. I think that makes the whole difference. And employees have seen, those that have taken that empathetic approach have seen massive benefits to it. One is 21% high profitability. The other one is 61% greater innovations for those companies that lead with an empathetic culture. So clearly there's something there, right? For anyone who's listening and thinking about their company culture, that's definitely another one. Something else, recognition and engagement. Well-recognized employees are 7 times more likely to be fully engaged, and organizations with everyday recognition see a 31% reduction in voluntary turnover. Two-thirds, 66%, of employees would quit if they felt unappreciated. So again, that approach of trust, that approach of just appreciation, with leading with that empathy, creating that's positive culture, that's psychologically safe culture ultimately, and we'll come to that in a second. That's what matters to this new generation. That's what employers need to look for. So yeah, when we talk about psychological safety, obviously there's high risk of companies not when they don't adopt that. And there's kind of statistics around this which shows that when psychological safety is high, only 3% of employees are likely to quit within a year. When it's low psychological safety environment, that risk jumps to 12%. Huge jump, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that's kind of what everyone, our generation, is looking for, is just that place where they actually feel safe, where they actually feel they can be themselves, where they can bring themselves into the workplace fully. And it's unfortunate to see, that some organizations still don't value this and they still don't see this, especially with this new generation coming up, where they want to feel appreciated, they want to feel like their work has an impact, they want to feel their values match their workplace. That's something that's, yeah, super important. You see that shift, I think, and maybe the data just wasn't there at that time as well. Maybe it was similar. Maybe there was a lot of people that cared about their
Hmm.
purpose. At least that's not what our data shows right now. It was more around job security and all of that. I think that has changed, and it comes down to psychological safety. And again, there's kind of that statistic which shows that there's been a drop in a decline in psychological safety, which may explain that also short job tenure for Gen Z. But it was saying that basically the proportion of employees who feel that they can bring their whole selves to work has dropped from 66% in 2020 to 41% in 2024.
Yeah. I definitely feel there's a guarded aspect, at least I know I'd experienced that too, where it was like a protection piece, where if that environment, like, it wasn't psychologically safe or it was borderline toxic or fully toxic, you definitely, I think, just protect yourself and you bring the piece of you that just needs to be there to get the job done, but the whole you doesn't get to show up because I feel like the whole you is reserved for safe, inclusive, respectful environments. And if your fight or flight goes off and you go, danger, this isn't safe, I need to be here to get this done, why would you
Yeah. Yeah.
present your whole self? You won't, you wouldn't. And then I feel like if you're not presenting your whole self, the employer is not getting your full capability being showcased. It's just a shell. You're a shell.
Yeah, and that's where it comes into play of like, why are those companies that do prioritize psychological safety have a
Mhm.
20% increase in profitability, 61% of innovation, especially innovation is directly linked to people being able to feel safe, because to innovate, you need to feel safe, you need to feel vulnerable enough to actually open up and share all your ideas, because most ideas aren't great, but it's by expressing those ideas that you find that one idea that is great,
Mhm.
and that can actually help the business and do all of that. But if you're not safe in the first place to share any idea, then that one idea amongst, the 10, 20 ideas that you may have is never going to come to light. And
100%.
yeah, so I think that's a huge reason. I think you
And
really,
like we said in the previous podcast was if you have a silent meeting, probably doesn't mean you're doing a good job. It probably means that your people are very nervous to speak up or share, disagree, whatever it may be. So just that caution again that quiet meetings aren't necessarily good meetings.
no. And it shows again, I think it shows and can explain why people that are in those silent meetings might give their notice very quickly, right, to leave. Because
Yes.
like, I think, and especially this new generation. Yeah.
So, speaking of the new generation, let's talk about we've talked a lot like why people might leave, what could you do to kind of engage this new age of loyalty, but there's another layer which kind of bridges to within the psychologically safe workplace, and they're two different kind of levels or divisions of loyalty. So we have emotional loyalty that we want to strive for, and then there's also transactional loyalty, which I'd actually never really heard of transactional loyalty. Like, once I read it, I'm like, "Oh, yeah. No, that makes sense." I just never put a definition to what I had been thinking. So, I assume our listeners are also like, "What are you talking about? What's emotional loyalty?"
I don't
But
even know. So yeah, please explain to me what
so
it is.
emotional loyalty is when employees feel personally connected to their workplace. So showing up as your whole you, right? Not showing up as that shell. They trust their leaders, they believe in the mission, they feel valued, and they want to be a part of something bigger. So we like to think of it like I stay because I care, not I stay because of a pension, or I stay because of XYZ, or I stay because I need the money, but what an environment, right? You stay because you want to, because you care. Now, transactional loyalty, it is all about what you get. So you're staying due to like the dangling carrot. So you get good pay, you're getting a benefit program, you're getting promotions. So it's more of like, I stay because it makes sense right now. Which I don't know about you, but I've definitely said that multiple times in my life where I'm like, so it was transactional loyalty,
Yeah.
right? Like, I know teaching, I was like, I'll stay because I have a pension. Yay. I'll stay because, it's good pay. I'll stay because, I do love me a good benefit plan and I like to get my
Okay.
massages and acupuncture and everything else. It was very appealing. But when you take that step back, I can definitely see now I would want emotional loyalty over transactional loyalty. And that's exactly what we see. So back in the lifer era, transactional loyalty was king. Emotional loyalty wasn't even on the radar. So you got a pension, you probably got the health benefits and the security if you stayed. But like I said, now those guarantees are kind of gone. Like we've talked about, there are people, especially Gen Z millennials, who are like, I don't care about a pension. A benefit plan's a good plus, but it's not essential, right? They're caring more about what's going to drive their long-term commitment to the company, which is rooted in the I stay because I care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that changes everything, and I think that shows that massive change between transactional. I want to make that money now. Yeah, like those statistics that show that people want to feel like they have a sense of purpose. That's definite emotional loyalty if they stay, right? Or if they leave, it means that they haven't found that. And I think that's yeah, that's super interesting. I really didn't see that. I didn't know there was yeah, I just kind of didn't brand it that in those ways, and I think that's super interesting quote.
And like what's crazy to bridge on that, Tris, like I love how you're like, I didn't see it this way. Neither did I.
Yeah.
Like, neither did I. And I feel from a personal standpoint, but also from like what I've been hearing from different people in different professions, different career spaces, they go, well, if I leave, I get told I'm lazy or I'm entitled.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's far too common. But the reality is, people are leaving because they're looking for purpose, like we've talked about, support, room to grow. And if they don't get that, they're going to walk. We're probably going to walk. And a LinkedIn study from 2023, they backed this up and they said culture and flexibility are now the top decision makers when choosing whether to stay or go. Workers want purpose, autonomy, and a healthy environment, not just a paycheck.
Yeah.
So we are now gaining a little bit of that insight into there truly has been a shift from transactional loyalty to emotional loyalty.
Yeah, super interesting quote.
And we'll stop here today. And to our listeners, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with the second part of this episode, where we'll dive a bit deeper into what modern leadership needs to look like and take into account today to build loyalty with this new modern workforce. So we'll give some practical tips and loads more information on this. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and don't forget to follow, share, and subscribe to our podcast. Take care. Have a good day.